Okay, we are on Vanderbeekers, chapter 20. Isa and Jessie changed silently in their bedroom and tossed their food-splattered clothes into the laundry hamper. Outside, the wind swooshed and whistled. Isa left the room with her violin in hand, and Jessie found herself alone with her thoughts. Isa's angry words from the previous day kept running through her head. "Do you have the right to make decisions for me? We are not the same." Jessie recalled the tears running down her sister's face at the idea of Benny taking another girl to the dance. Did Isa really like Benny? What if Isa and Benny didn't reconcile before they moved? Jessie looked around the room. She thought about all the nights they had stayed up late, talking in whispers and using their pillows to muffle their laughter. Jessie saw Isa's perfectly made bed and her own bed with its twisted sheets and rumpled blankets. In the corner of the room, the big window, there was a loose floorboard that the twins had pried up 5 years earlier when they were convinced that a treasure was hidden underneath. Now they used the space to stash Halloween candy before Mama confiscated it. Jessie took a deep breath. She couldn't fix the Biderman problem. She couldn't fix the moving problem, but she could try to fix the Benny problem. Mr. Van Houten, his violin case slung over his shoulder, blew into the brownstone right before dinner began, exclaiming over the severe weather. He whipped off his hat, revealing a head of unruly hair. He greeted the adults, hugged the kids, and kissed friends right on the lips. After numerous runs up and down the stairs to retrieve food and flatware and dishes, the table was finally set. Auntie Harrigan added her own contributions to the table, a glazed ham and a flourless chocolate cake. Miss Josie sat at a pot of collard greens and southern cornbread. Gloom hung heavy over dinner table as the kids sat themselves down for their final Christmas Eve dinner in the brownstone. Papa said the blessings and thanked everyone for coming. After a round of applause for the cooks, the twins looking like they were being sentenced to a year's worth of dishwashing, everyone dug in. Oliver made a point to avoid the beef stew when it was offered to him. He surreptitiously observed everyone else as they scooped large ladlefuls into their bowls. When no one spit it out, Oliver reached across the table to ladle a small amount of the stew into his bowl, then took a tentative sip. But wait, it tasted normal. What happened to all the salt? Auntie Harrigan nudged his arm and winked. "Amazing what a little extra water and broth could do," she whispered. "Ah," Oliver said. He looked over at Uncle Arthur, who saluted Oliver with his soup spoon. "I guess this will bump up their edible meal percentage." Auntie Harrigan shrugged. "I do what I gotta do," she responded. A more morose Christmas Eve dinner had never been had among the Vanderbeekers. Every window rattled ominously against the wind, which increased in severity throughout the meal. The adults provided most of the conversation, and the kids offered one-word answers whenever a question was directed at them, with the exception of Lainey, who offered a running commentary of every thought that went through her head. Dinner was not a long affair. No one had an appetite. Finally, Mr. Jeet leaned over and whispered conspiratorially to Lainey. When she nodded, Mr. Jeet called for everyone's attention. "We have a special treat for you," Mr. Jeet announced. "Please gather around." Lainey sought out Paganini from under the fronds of a potted palm tree. The jaunty bow tie she had tied around his neck earlier had vanished. Lainey lured Paganini out with a few carrot pieces, then led him to the center of the living room. And now, grand presenting the famous Paganini. She gestured to Paganini, who was grooming his ears. The puzzled audience looked at Paganini, unsure why they were doing so. "We will now demonstrate Paganini's smartness," Lainey announced. Oliver choked on water he was drinking, and Uncle Arthur pounded on his back. Lainey walked over to the other side of the room, then said, "Paganini, come." Paganini hopped over to Lainey and sat up on his hind legs. The audience clapped and nodded in appreciation, impressed by that Paganini was not hard of hearing, as previously believed. "Good boy, Paganini," Lainey exclaimed, giving him a carrot. "I knew there was something funny going on with that bunny," Auntie Harrigan commented under her breath to Uncle Arthur. When the applause quieted down, Lainey began again. "And now, another trick." She walked 10 feet away from Mr. Jeet, and Paganini followed her. Mr. Jeet held an embroidery hoop 1 inch off the floor. "Paganini, hoop," Mr. Jeet called out. Paganini zigzagged over to Mr. Jeet and executed a clean jump through the hoop. Mama's jaw dropped. A slow grin came over Papa's face. Even Oliver was impressed. When the room quieted down, Lainey gave another command. "Paganini, lie down." Paganini flopped on his side, an ear hanging over his eye. The audience cheered. "Last trick," said Lainey. Mr. Jeet leaned down and placed a toy piano in the floor in front of him. "Paganini, play piano." Paganini scrambled up from his prone position and hopped onto the piano. Then he placed his front paws on the keyboard and pressed down, creating a discordant chord. And for that moment, the Vanderbeekers kids forgot their troubles and joined the adults in loud applause and cheers. Mr. Jeet and Lainey stood up together and held hands, then took a deep bow. Encore, encore, Papa shouted. Jessie took off one of the flowers from the vase of the dining room table and tossed it at Lainey's feet. When Paganini tried to eat it, Mr. G reached down to rescue the flower and handed it to Lainey with a gallant nod. Lainey curtsied 7 times before running to Mama and jumping into her arms. There was such terrific noise following Paganini's show that at first no one noticed the persistent banging on the ceiling, dull thuds that came in short spurts before starting again. Mama leaned over to Papa. "Do you hear that noise?" Papa, who was congratulating Mr. D, paused to listen. The banging began again. "I think it's coming from upstairs," Mama said uneasily. Isa's good mood after Lainey's bunny performance vanished. She glared at the ceiling as if she could beam lasers from her eyes and decimate the upstairs occupant. One by one, people began to glance upward. What's the banging, Papa?" Lainey asked. "I think it's Mr. Biderman," Miss Josie said apologetically. "He does that sometimes when people come over. I think we get a little loud for him." Every single person in the room stared at her. "Did you say Biderman?" asked Mr. Van Houten, a peculiar look on his face. "He banged your ceiling?" said Mama, shocked. "Down with the Biderman!" shouted Oliver, first raising his fist raised high above his head. Miss Josie lifted her hands helplessly, as if apologizing. The room buzzed with indignation when the banging resumed, louder than ever. Isa shot out of her chair. She grabbed her violin from the console next to the front entrance, jerked the door open, and took the stairs, 2 at a time, up to the Biderman's apartment. Isa could vaguely hear her family rush out behind her, but it didn't stop her from pounding a fist on the door. It opened with a terrific bang, as if the Biderman had been waiting for Isa to arrive. "What?" the Biderman roared. His eyes flashed, and he loomed above Isa in his midnight black clothes. The wind howled around the brownstone. Isa, her usually tidy hair now in angry halo, pointed the tip of her violin bow 1 inch from the Biderman's cold heart. "You," Isa spoke in a low, dangerous voice, "you are a terrible, grouchy, horrible person. You are mean to Miss Josie and Mr. G. You're making us move for no reason, and here you are ruining our last Christmas here." Isa pushed the hair off her shoulder and put her violin up, clenched her eyes shut, and crashed her bow on the street. The piece was less furious, and Isa's playing was harsh and unrelenting. It was as if she was dueling against her own fury and disappointment and frustration and loneliness. Around her, the brownstone braced itself against the wind and against her rage. She played because the Biderman was cruel. She played because she had disappointed her parents and failed her siblings. She played because Benny hated her. She played because they had to move out of the home they loved. She played because she was fighting with her sister and best friend, the person she loved most in the world. She played because she had failed their mission, and now there was nothing else she could do. The music exploded through the brownstone, reverberating through the brick walls and making the air crackle. The brownstone shuddered and shook. Outside the water wall was a frenzy of chimes knocking madly into each other, and the sounds of the crashing metal. When it seemed as if the walls themselves would start to crumble, the tension eased. Almost imperceptibly, Isa's violin gentled, as if coaxing less furies into submission. Then quietly, so quietly, her bow glided along the first note of the swan, as if less furies had cleansed her heart of her rage. The swan opened up space for Grace to enter in again. The wind outside eased, and the brownstone groaned with relief. Isa's bow slowed as she came to the end of the piece, suspended over the last ethereal high note. The sound continued to ring throughout the brownstone long after the bow had left the violin. When Isa opened her eyes, she had forgotten where she was. The Biderman stood in front of her, his face so pale his skin almost looked translucent. Isa took down her violin and found herself reaching out to touch his arm. The Biderman stepped back and lifted his head to look at her with miserable, watery eyes. "I'm so sorry," the Biderman rasped. He glanced at Isa and her violin for another long moment. Then he closed the door in her face. Oh, this book is getting really intense. Okay, I hope you enjoyed that chapter. I'll do a next one. I'll do another one soon. Bye, Hannah.